hope you managed to squeeze in a coffee from the last session. So this session is all about modernising the civil service, and in a moment I will introduce, if you don't know him already, Gus O'Donnell, who used to be the Cabinet Secretary here in the UK. Most of you know me already from the opening session, so I'm Siobhan Benita, and I moderate a lot of the sessions for Global Government Forum, but I also work with GGF in an advisory role, and I'm going to be talking to you today about one of those projects where I've been working with GGF in that role. So for the past 10 years, Global Government Forum have actually brought together the world's most senior public servants at what they call the annual Global Government Summit. And in January 2023, at that summit, the Cabinet Secretary of Barbados was really struck by the number of common challenges facing government leaders, regardless of the size of their country or its economic standing. And she felt that many cabinet secretaries like her, in her words, were just batting in the dark when it came to leading an effective modern public service. So inspired by Donna's call to action, we at Government Global Forum, we set out to see if we could try and map the key features of an effective civil service or public service. And never, as you've heard already today, never has this work been more important, because with global conflicts, with post-COVID recovery, the transition to net zero, rise of populism, and the emergence of new technologies, including generative AI, these are just some of the factors testing the capabilities of governments around the world. So as part of our work, we interviewed 12 serving public servants from around the world, you can see there. So they were all cabinet secretary level, or in those countries where they have more political civil servants as well, they were the most senior impartial civil servant. We then asked Lord Gus O'Donnell to help us in this work, to lead those interviews, and we were delighted that he said yes. And in a moment, when I've just run through very quickly the research, I'm going to be asking Gus some questions about kind of how he found this work, why he agreed to do it as well. And I will hopefully give some time for you to put questions to Gus after we've done that as well. So from the interviews, so I won't be able to go through everything because there's a lot of research, but you might be able to just see some of the quotes of the people that we interviewed as I go through the slides. But from the interviews and also some of the other work that we do in GGF, we identified 5 desirable features of a modern, effective civil service. And we've begun to unpick what these mean in practice. And it's just the first stage of GGF's work to try and develop that blueprint that Donna from Barbados called for, which we hope will help public service leaders around the world understand how well prepared they really are to meet today's challenges and, crucially, to deliver excellent services to their citizens. So, the first one was strong leadership. So a good civil service, this is what I'm saying, needs strong leadership with mutual respect and alignment between ministers and senior officials. So a lot of our interviewees, the leaders we spoke to, said that for government to function well, ministers and officials need to have a shared vision and a mutual respect for each other's objectives and responsibilities. But many of those leaders told us it's getting increasingly difficult to align short-term political priorities and behaviours with the longer-term stewardship function that Alex was talking about earlier of public servants. And some of the key issues that were really arising in terms of challenges here were ministers not understanding the function of the civil service, a rise in more extreme populist politics that threatens institutions and traditional processes, and ministers publicly falling out with their senior officials. So here in the UK, for example, we've seen the civil service described as the blob, and in the USA, Trump, himself facing numerous criminal charges, has vowed to remove tens of thousands of impartial staff if he's re-elected. So it certainly feels to us and to the leaders that we interviewed that the rules of the game have changed. All of this undermines leadership at the top of government and leads to suboptimal performance and a great deal of stress. So what are some of the possible solutions? Some countries like Australia and Canada, so I'm flicking around a bit there, you see there, some of them there have clear description of their stewardship function, and this can certainly help to build a shared vision. But it might also surprise people, maybe not here in the room, but maybe the public might be surprised, that ministers don't even get basic training in the role of the civil service and their officials. And all of the people we interviewed said that should change. Our interviewees also said that we need leaders, both ministers and senior officials, who will defend their staff publicly in the face of increasing attacks and counter that populist narrative that the civil service is somehow part of a deep state working against the people. So the second feature was we need a highly skilled, inclusive and thriving workforce. To meet this task of delivering excellent public services in the light of all these challenges you heard about this morning, the civil service has to nurture a thriving workforce that is highly skilled and representative of the public it serves. And our research has shown that there are some stubborn barriers to achieving this. So it's not easy to attract and retain the best talent, especially in data, digital, and increasingly AI roles. Some of the hurdles include clunky recruitment processes, unconscious bias in hiring and the promotion procedures, and, a big one, salaries that compare unfavourably to the private sector. Now, making a difference to people's lives is a motivating factor, and it's enough for some people to come into the public sector, but it's not enough if you can't pay the rent. And there are also lots of private sector companies nowadays who also champion their own social and environmental values, so they're also making a difference to people's lives. So the civil services around the world need to look at the way they hire staff, they need to be more pacey, they need to create more flow between sectors, also between academia and social enterprises, not just the private sector, and they need to become more comfortable with fixed term and more dynamic arrangements. Civil service leaders told us that they also need to consider the next generation of staff more, and our research showed that younger recruits are much more likely to ask about the mental health support that's available and to value their well-being. So civil service leaders need to be mindful of the possibility of burnout and the risk of, and we already heard this today, this morning I was interested, continuously asking staff just to do more with less. And then finally, a lot came up about civil service leaders needing a proper plan for what hybrid and flexible working actually means in the new normal. I'm going to flick through the quotes there. So the third feature that we discovered was an agile, digital and risk-taking culture. This has come up a lot in the sessions this morning. This is really what today is all about, the need to be more entrepreneurial and innovative. Now, I mentioned already that ministers often unfairly perceive officials to be blocking progress, but they aren't always wrong. It's also true that bureaucracies, silos, and traditional ways of working can undoubtedly frustrate decision-making and stifle innovation. Agility was imperative during COVID, and it's going to remain crucial if civil servants are going to address those big challenges that we face. So many of the leaders that Gus interviewed talked about initiatives that they'd established to foster a more entrepreneurial culture, whether that be a central unit tasked with trialling new approaches or the creation of innovation champions in departments. The crucial thing was that these officials were given time, funding, and the permission to fail. But perhaps the single biggest factor that will impact the way civil servants work is technology. We're going to hear loads about that again today, and the adoption of AI. So unsurprisingly, our interviews showed that leaders believe AI will fundamentally transform internal operations and the way that services are delivered to the public. It really does have the potential to rocket boost capacity and productivity, scooping up all those repetitive and diagnostic tasks, and to bespoke services to the public to an extent that we're only just starting to understand. But there are huge risks attached with AI too, and it raises significant ethical questions. If used incorrectly, it could embed prejudices into decision-making, and bad players are already using AI to disrupt democratic processes. So our research showed that a modern civil service needs to get ahead of the AI game. We need to embrace it, but also work out in collaboration with other countries how it can be properly managed. And finally, the public sector can't do anything on AI if it doesn't have the basics of digital in place. We really need to get on top of good data management, interoperable systems, and all of those things we've already been working on. The fourth feature that we found was a collaborative working structures that transcend organisational silos. And again, this comes up all the time. So I joined the civil service in 1996. And the big push at the time when I joined, guess what, was for more joined up working across departmental silos. That's almost 30 years ago. And civil servants are still pushing for it today. A need to work more effectively and efficiently across government came out of all the interviews that we did, and it regularly comes up in webinars and other events that we hold here in GGF. Now, of all the issues to emerge, this one sounds like it should be the least complex, but it's proving to be really stubborn. We know it can be done. During the pandemic, for example, ministers, officials, and experts from a host of policy areas worked alongside each other in ways they'd never done before. But without the necessity of a crisis, silo working remains deeply ingrained. From the allocation of budgets to the way policy advice and decision-making occurs, the civil service still operates mainly in vertical structures. Our research showed a modern civil service needs to function horizontally. Climate change, for example, can't be achieved by a single department alone. It needs coordination of policy and, crucially, of funding across all government departments. Similarly, digital transformation isn't just about fancy websites in one department, it's about transforming the way everything happens behind the scenes across lots of departments. So some of the ways are the people we spoke to said this can be achieved. Having a unit whose job it is to lead collaboration and transformation. And several of the leaders we interviewed from different countries mentioned, for example, the delivery unit that had been established under New Labour. Changing funding and budget arrangements to disincentivise silos and creating more spaces where ministers, officials and experts can work together is key. And then finally, the fifth feature that we discovered, a service that is trusted by its users and the public. And again, trust came up in the 3 opening speeches this morning. Time and time again, in the interviews that we conducted and in the webinars and other events that we run, people stress how vital public trust is for a functioning public service. And unfortunately, there are quite a few factors nowadays working to undermine public trust. Technology, things like deep fake videos and audios can be used to spread misinformation. Populist politicians, often supported by media with vested interests, will paint civil servants as part of an out-of-touch establishment. Social media channels can conflate a conspiracy theory and send fake news all around the world in a matter of moments. Our research has highlighted a few things that might help. Firstly, you have to deliver great services. All the polling shows that people's trust in government and the civil service goes up if they have a good experience. Think, for example, in the UK of how quick it is now to renew your driving licence. So being competent is key. But beyond that, having a plan to tackle fake news, ensuring excellent communication with communities and the public so that decision-making feels more transparent and inclusive is important. And also having ways to celebrate success is really important, like the Civil Service Awards that we have here in the UK. Finally, there are some other things. But that's a very quick run-through of the 5 features. I'm now going to go over... Thanks. Thank you. I'm now wearing this for nothing. So I'm now going to go over to ask us some questions. Could we get the slide up again with the 5 features? It's the next slide. Thanks. I don't have to click it here. But Gus, I'm interested, thank you. I'm interested, first of all, you're a very busy man. You've got lots of other things you could have been doing. When we came to you, GGF, and said, would you be involved in this work? Why did you say yes? Why do you think it's so important?
Big question, and can you hear me, first of all? Yeah, good. So it wasn't the fee, which was a round number, 0. It was basically guilt. When I look back on it, I think, and this room reminds me of it, during my time, it was relatively easy. I had one big financial crisis, which was the global financial crisis, which we had the G20 meeting in this very building when, if you remember, Gordon Brown saved the world with a little bit of help from President Obama and a few other leaders. But other than that, when I look at the things that you listed there, I see the issues around decarbonisation, right? They're all the Ds. Digitization, deglobalization, the problems about the death of democracy, all of those sorts of things, aging societies. My treasury background says me public finances. We are going to have to spend a huge amount on defense because of all the global factors that are going on. We are also, because of the way we dealt with COVID, and I think it was absolutely right, we borrowed a lot of money. So the second largest public spending program in the UK is debt interest. So it's going to be really difficult for governments to cope with these. I thought what we should do is harness the ability of everyone around the world who's dealing with nearly all the same questions. How are they managing it? Could we learn from each other? And could we therefore bequeath to the next generation coming through some answers to these questions and some lessons about things that work and things that don't work?
So I'm just curious, some of the findings that came out then, because obviously you were leading the interviews, but we didn't get to interview you yourself in terms of some of these issues.
No, big mistake, wasn't it? Should have done.
We should have done. So I'm going to do a bit of that now. But so that relationship between ministers and officials, which I referred to, which is sometimes quite problematic now, how has that relationship changed since you were Cabinet Secretary?
I think what we've observed is, you mentioned the word trust. That trust between ministers and officials seems to have broken down. You've got ministers briefing that it was all the civil services fault, sometimes some counter briefing going on. So when you look at a country like Singapore, where you have ministers and officials round the table, and the ministers have all been officials, and they're all paid very well, there's an enormous amount of mutual respect and trust and mutual understanding that they need to sort out what the outcomes are. That's broken down as far as I can see. When you look at the figures for trust, the Ipsos Mori Index, politicians is 9%. London residents, 3%. 25 to 34-year-old age group, 2%. That's how much people trust politicians, right? It's horrific. Fortunately, the civil service is above 50%, but there is still a problem that our politics is breaking down, and that trust in governments, at the same time as we're asking governments to do more than they've ever done. So, it's not like we've got a small state, we've got a bigger state than ever. So it's a strange paradox that we've got a period where there's not much trust, and yet people want government to do more.
And I guess they saw government doing more during the pandemic. It's kind of raised expectations. Yeah. I will be coming to the audience in a couple of minutes, but I've just got a couple of other things to ask for Gus. So AI is one of the biggest topics that are in all of the sessions today. So I just want your thoughts overall. Do you think overall AI is going to be a force for good in terms of the way we can change public services through using AI and the delivery of public services? Or are you more concerned about the risks that it poses to things like the democratic process?
So I think AI is inevitable, and therefore we have to make sure that we exploit all the opportunities whilst ensuring that we cover the risks. So there's no good putting your head in the sand and thinking, well, let's have nothing to do with it because some bad things could happen. It's going to happen. It's invading every aspect of our lives. We're all using it. So let's get on and make sure that we make the most of the opportunities and understand the risks. If anyone wants to know about the risks, look at the Slovakian election, the fake audios that went out in the last 48 hours when there's a blackout on mainstream media. You imagine if in those last 24 hours of the next UK election, which is coming up, someone puts out a fake audio and the BBC, God bless them, will not be allowed to knock it down because, the blackout of our 24 hours for us, there's going to be some massive problems. We're at that stage in AI where the abilities of Gen AI and others to do fakes is very strong, and the technology is not yet catching up to be able to counter that effectively. So, yeah, very, very dangerous 12 months. But AI, got to make the most of it, embrace it.
And are you confident that the public sector can regulate AI to mitigate some of those risks, or is this just an impossible thing to get on top of?
We will have to regulate it. I'm a member of the Lords. We're doing various things which are involved in regulation. There's the EU regulation going out there at the moment about online stuff. I don't think we'll do it well, because regulating for something which is as fast moving as AI is really difficult. Because once you put legislation on the books, it's very static. It's very hard to do dynamic legislation. Therefore, whatever we legislate for now will be out of date in 12 months' time. So we need nimble, agile regulators with a bit of discretion and freedom, and we need to make sure that we stay on top of it and keep thinking about how to make sure that we're getting the most of it without the really risky harms that we all know about.
And my final question before we come to the audience, so be getting your questions ready, is, was there anything in the interviews at all that surprised you?
So there's that certain ambivalence about consultants. You know, there were some who were thinking about wanting more, and some were saying there were too many. There was a surprise that they weren't as concerned as I was about ministerial training, right? Not all, because actually, when you look at the ministers in Singapore, they're incredibly well trained. I mean, they've actually been civil servants, you know, and we have a shock when one of our civil servants goes to work for a political party. Well, I couldn't think of anything better. I'd want all my ministers to have spent some time in the civil service of all parties, you know, so they actually understand the delivery arm of the policies they're instructing. And I think training, you know, like training in decision-making under uncertainty, which is what they're going to spend their time doing. We've all got training. You're all here training. I mean, why do we think that we can elect someone where, you know, if Labour were to win the next election, 7 of them have been ministers before. I've dealt with prime ministers who've come through that door. You think about Tony Blair, you think about David Cameron, you think about a possible Keir Starmer. They've never been a junior minister, let alone prime minister, and suddenly they're in charge of, you know, I'm going to confront them as cabinet secretary, some of the most horrific decisions they've ever had in their lives. And they're going to change where they live, and they're going to live above the shop, and, you know, it's just horribly unhealthy lifestyle I'm about to impose on them.
So more I love the fact that Gus can speak a lot more freely now than he could when he was Cabinet Secretary. So
this is off the record, isn't it?
This is absolutely off the record. Just everybody here can tweet about it or X about it or whatever. So any questions about the research, or while we've got Gus in the room, any questions to Gus at all? So we have a lady here in the orange jacket, and then there was a gentleman there, and then I'll come to this side of the room. So if you could keep your hand up, thank you. Do we have a second microphone in here? I don't know, because we've got a gentleman there as well. We could be getting that ready. Thanks. Okay.
Thanks, Gus. Hi, everyone. I'm Vimbai. I work in the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. So my question is on the back of a point that was mentioned earlier around a thriving workforce and creating a space that represents the people that are within our community. How do you think we can make the UK government more diverse, particularly in leadership positions?
Whoa, that's a really good question. I remember when I first arrived in the civil service, the diversity problem was dramatic, right? It was a gender thing. You know, you looked up and there's all old white men who'd been to Oxford who referred to me as Dear O'Donnell, you know, and it really annoyed me because they'd all been at public school. It's changed. It's got a lot better in some respects. We are still, I think, some way behind in terms of ethnic diversity. The gender thing's got better, but we are now getting what I regard as the big diversity issue of the future, which is the civil service. If you go through the fast stream and all the rest of it, and you're in London, you can't get onto the property market. It's just impossible. The salaries are way too low. And what happens is the people that stay in it are like my daughter, who've got the bank of mum and dad, right? That is not diversity, right? having rich parents is not going to give us a civil service that reflects the society that we need. So I think diversity is a massive issue for the civil service. And the way I would do it is with a good treasury hat on. I'd pay everybody more, which you're going to like, and I'd reduce your pensions, which you're not going to like, right? But I'm a treasury person. You expect me to look after the taxpayer and all of this. There are lots of things we could do, and lots of things we could do, I think, to kind of promote the fact that the civil service should be the place that anyone from a diverse background wants to go more than anywhere else, because we should be the ultimate meritocracy. If you're good, you should get promoted. And that's why I really despair when you see politicians interfering in this process such that the best person doesn't get the job. So that, to me, is how we tackle diversity, meritocracy, and sort out the pay.
Thanks. I'm really conscious, unfortunately, Gus has got to run off after this session, so we've probably got time for 2 more questions. There was a hand up there, and then okay, we'll come to that lady in the pink jacket afterwards. If you could keep your hand up after, they'll bring the mic to you. Okay, thanks.
Hiya, I'm Sam, I'm also from DEFRA. I think as this conference is Innovate Conference, and you've mentioned a few times, how do you think we can balance the idea of risk-taking and freedom to fail as a civil servant with providing a service that's trusted by the public and is run by ministers accountable to the public, where if we fail, we could risk, millions of pounds of public money? What role do we have in innovating while providing that service?
Right, and I think the simple answer to that is that you've got to fail, right? We've got to do a lot more pilots. We've got to do a lot more thinking about experiments. I'm talking to David Halpin about some of the stuff that Behavioural Insights team are doing around the world. We've got to find a way to fail and fail early so we don't lose millions, right? We've got to also basically rip up the National Audit Office, all right, and get them to start thinking about, as we had in the project delivery session I was listening to, making sure things are right from the start, right? So most of the failures occur because we launch on something far too quickly with the minister making the announcement, and we're going to do this in 5 years' time, and there's no plan for it, there's no project. We need to basically sort out in advance how we're going to do this. Have we tested it? Are we thinking about the evidence from around the world about what makes sense? Can we find ways of failing early to ensure that we succeed in the long term? You're absolutely right that the public are getting used to having, really fancy services and expecting the worst of us. But actually, when we do it well, you mentioned car tax. I remember, queuing up in a post office. But also, there's something in the Times today about the tell us once thing, which I remember setting up with Lee Lewis, Perm Set at DWP, where, when someone's died, it's like you don't have to give them your information millions of times. Brilliant service. She's praising it. And she's then contrasting it with the problems she's having with the private sector. So let's not knock ourselves too much. We need to do this well because it matters for the community. It's good to see the DEFRA people here. You have a great Perm Sec in Tamara. And one of the things actually that I think is important for the community is when we think about these services, we tend to think of the public sector and the private sector, and we miss out communities and civil society. That's really important. And they can tell you about, it's that customer feedback, which is really, really important early on. So to my mind, don't be worried about failing. Do it early, do it small, and basically just get rid of the NAO and make them an ex-ante body.
That will be the headline from this session. Gus says, get rid of the NAO. Final question here.
Hi, Gus. I've worked at Cabinet Office for about 25 years, and now my career's stopped because of the location strategy, and we can't move in London. You can't get a new job in London. I just wondered what your thoughts are about that.
So I've actually been up to Darlington to see them all there, and I liked it. What I most liked was the fact that there were, we're talking about cross-cutting stuff. On one floor, there were people from 3 different departments, no walls. I mean, wow, they actually talk to each other. This is a good thing. So I am in favour of thinking about what we can do in different parts of the country, and particularly with the move to home working more, do we really need this? One of the problems when I remember early on, we sent people out to Sheffield, Manpower Services Commission. God, it's going back a long way. And the problem was the ministers would never get involved in going up there or in doing stuff on video. Now, COVID has just forced them all into Zoom and Teams, and they kind of get that. So it's a lot easier now to manage hybrid meetings and manage people not around. I'd like them more to visit. So I am in favour of dispersing civil servants around when we can. And I think that gets to one of the issues about pay, because obviously you've got relatively national pay scales, and house prices are wildly different around the country. So you can attract people. I remember in my day, turnover rates for staff outside London were much, much lower than they were in London. So I'm afraid I'm not really helping you there, because I'm saying, look, there's some great places out there. As a London boy, of course, I can say this easily, but I mean, I hope that we will have a civil service that is more dispersed in the future.
But equally, what you're saying as well is there should be flexible solutions, I think, for people in London
God.
using some of the technology available in hybrid working.
Totally.